Hi, this is Jundo. Welcome to Tree Leaf. And here I am out of the bed and also waiting to hear the news and my exact release time from this incarnation in the hospital and to move on to what comes next. As we spoke about yesterday, all things begin ever again, and I'm very happy to be leaving here. Some people are not as fortunate as me. Most of the people I spoke about in my earlier talk, the fellow with disabilities, they live with this every day. Now, I still have a long road ahead of me, recovery and pain, and it's going to take a while. I got to put all my food in the blender for a while, and but at least I get to sleep in my own bed comfortably, as long as I don't roll on one side. But the fact of the matter is, the people we spoke about the other day, to be Buddhist priests, have been going with this long term, and they're not fly-by-night people. You know, somebody asked why they would want to join these organizations. If they're good priests, just let them be a good priest, and they get transmission from their teacher. And what do they care about being members of this organization? Well, there are two reasons. Seems silly, but there are two reasons. Number one is the organizations are about fellowship. Aren't disabled and poor people and the mothers of disabled children, aren't they entitled to fellowship, having some peers, being allowed in the community? The other reason is these organizations have gradually taken on the status of being, shall we say, certificates of quality conveyors. If you're a member of the organization, it means that you're, for example, not like a counterfeit, second-hand, falsely named product. You know, it means it's a seal of approval. You're not buyer beware. It's become a stamp to certify that the teachers in the organization meet certain standards. So that implies that the teachers outside don't meet those standards. Do the disabled, do the women who are struggling, do the poor, who are serious and dedicated Zen students but have to go about this a different way through life's ango of hard knocks, are they not entitled to not only the fellowship, but do they need to be listed as second-hand students, or not real, or not authentic, or at least have it implied because they're not admitted to the organization? Here's an easy solution. Just look at who these people are. Let them in the organization. Zen teachers are supposed to be really good at looking past surfaces and manifesting compassion. But I want to tell you that actually the history of Buddhism, and this is where I'm going to get in a little trouble today, the history of Buddhism is not so clean on this issue. In the past, the Buddha himself had certain physical requirements, at least if he was involved at the time of the Vinaya, for people who were admitted in his Sangha. But once someone became sick, the other monks would nurse them and take care of them. And they did, in those days, they seemed basically to be concerned with preventing communicable diseases like tuberculosis from spreading in the Sangha. But if you look at the whole history of Buddhism, people with disabilities who could not meet the physical requirements of being a monk didn't become monks. And women were allowed to be monks, but there was always that second class status that has persisted even to this day in Thailand, where there's really no recognized female lineage. And Zen in Japan, boy, the women had to fight until only a few decades ago to get pretty much equal, separate but equal status with their own training centers. And in some ways, those training centers manifest a higher quality of practice than the men, I understand. But until that time, women were almost neglected. Now, Dogen, in some of his early writings, like Rai Haitokuzue, was very open about women. He said, learn from anyone. Learn from a potted plant if it has something to teach you. I don't say women are potted plants. I think you get my point. But he meant learn from anyone who's a good teacher, without age, a child, an old man. Doesn't matter. He had some women students. Whether he had them living at AAG or his other temples is not clear, but it was apparent that he had ordained and had some women students who, at the very least, he was training at a distance. One second, I'm going to grab something here. But after that, Soto Zen got a little funny. And there was a time when it was extremely discriminatory. For example, this is from the Tokugawa period. I'm going to bend over here to read this. Soto documents and recorded sermons frequently cite similar karmic notions, not only to justify existing social distinctions, but also to assert that outcasts, those were the untouchable classes in Japanese society, called the barakumen, the disabled, and other people deemed useless to society cannot possibly attain awakening. These are from Soto documents from the Tokugawa period. The blind cannot read the scriptures, the deaf cannot listen to sermons, the mute cannot chant, cripples cannot sit in a proper meditation posture, and as explained in the last 4 lines of a verse commonly cited in published Soto sermons, known as the 10 Fates preached by Buddha, short lifespans come from having butchered animals. Poverty and desperation comes from miserly thoughts. Being crippled and blind comes from violating the Buddhist precepts, all in a past life. That is from a paper by the great professor William Bodeford called Zen and the Art of Religious Prejudice. It's available online. In recent years, I've attended many Soto Zen temples in Japan, and I have seen very limited cases of people with disabilities admitted into Soto practice. And if I'm wrong, I would like anyone to correct me. But the fact of the matter is, I've seen people with slightly, for example, lame legs, or some slight inability to use their hand, or a limp. But anyone who was truly beyond that, physically incapable of the great demands of being a Zen monk, was simply denied the ability to be a Zen monk. Now, on the other hand, if in the old cases, in the Soto and the Rinzai school, if they had rich clients, sponsors, who were donors, they would very easily make them priests and give them Dharma transmission without the, here's a couple of pictures of some of these rich daimyo women and men dressed as priests. It's unlikely that they were expected to meet the full requirement of being a priest in those days. And on the other hand, the monasteries traditionally have been closed to the disabled and to women, to minority groups. Many of the people went there centuries ago were actually from a kind of elite. They were kind of the cast-off, maybe the third son from an elite family who had no place to go. They just did not open the doors to everybody. So there's always been a certain discrimination economically against women, against the disabled in Soto Zen. Now we are building a monastery, or they are building a monastery, the Soto Shu, here in California. Actually, I'm in Japan. It gets confusing. In Lake County, California, called Tenpyozan. And it's a beautiful place, and I support it tremendously. It will try to bring traditional Japanese monastic training ways to America as much as possible and introduce them to Americans who are so inclined to do it, and I support that. It's a great thing. But is it discriminatory? No. Well, yes, a little bit. Why? A couple of reasons. It's still not doing anything for the people I spoke about who cannot put up with the routine of Tenpyozan. Now, they could build a wheelchair ramp and they could be reasonably accommodating in many ways, but it's still not going to help the people I mentioned. So what are you going to do? Go back to that old Tokugawa period explanation? Well, that's just their karma, man. Let them try again next life. We don't do that, I don't think, in this modern world. In this modern Western world, we have to be more understanding that this is not the traditional conservative societies of the past. The disabled, women, homosexuals have a place. The poor have to be reached out more. There has to be more effort. Someone wrote me and said, well, I was poor and I went, and I wrote back and said, you can't have been that poor because you got the money to go. I'm talking about people the working poor, who really cannot afford to go but have proven track records of being able to do what a priest takes. There's another aspect of discrimination to Tenpyozan which I want to touch on completely. And I'm sorry to say this. There's still an example of this, many examples of this, that I encounter here in Japan. Zen is the Japanese way. Tenpyozan is being built to some extent to correct our faults of Zen in the United States and other Western countries. Boulder Dash. They are all good flowerings of Zen, and we need them all. I am a supporter of maintaining the traditional. I am also a supporter of letting many new and creative flowers bloom. Maybe this is because I'm a Jewish background. Let me explain this quickly. One of the reasons Judaism survived for so many thousands of years, I believe, is because we had all kinds. We had the people who would not change a thing and stuck by every rule. You know those guys. And we have them in Buddhism too, right? The guys who say strictly by the Vinaya. And then we had the innovators and the rule breakers and the triers of new things in Judaism. The guys looked askance at each other, but the fact of the matter is they needed each other. We need people who are trying to express Soto Zen Buddhism in new ways, and we need people who are preserving the old ways. We need all of it. So let's keep all of it. Tenpyozan is really good. I hope they have not only the ramps for the disabled, but they really need to work to be creative, to reach people like I was talking about, who could not even get to Tenpyozan in a dream. What are we going to do for them? So I'm going to continue to press and say, if Tenpyozan is not a discriminatory organization, it needs to be supplemented with other means to recognize good, ethical, dedicated Soto Zen and other Zen priests. Got it? Okay. That's my rant in the hall. And let's see what changes come to Soto Zen and the rest of Zen Buddhism in the coming years. All right. Now the doctor's going to come and tell me when I get to go home. Shall we sit for a minute?